Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Chase. I am the Associate Provost of the Berkeley Division of Computing, Data Science, and Society, and Dean of the School of Information. I would like to welcome all of you here to our Berkeley conversation on election security and integrity. We are now at an unprecedented time. The election is 8 days away, and we are subject to very unusual times with the pandemic, the increasing reliance on electronic voting, the current administration's handling of the contest, and possible foreign interference. How can we conduct elections and verify their results to ensure their security and their accuracy? We have here an amazing group of faculty from UC Berkeley to help us take a deep dive into this question. Our panelists are Henry Brady, who is Dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy and who has been working on elections. Susan Hyde, who is a professor of political science and interim co-director of the Institute for International Studies. Her area of expertise is international elections, which sheds a good deal of light on our current election here. Philip Stark, who is professor of statistics and Associate Dean of the Division of Mathematical and Physical Sciences. Philip is involved in so many aspects of election security and election integrity, and we'll be hearing from him. David Wagner is a professor of computer science. He is a world-leading expert in computer security. He has been working on election security for many years now. And Steve Weber, who is the Associate Dean and head of the Berkeley School of Information. Steve has very wide-ranging interests, very much spanning from information to global political interactions. And so he will be able to shed some light on information, misinformation, and foreign interference. We are going to turn to the questions in a moment. I would just like to tell you that this event is sponsored by the Berkeley Division of Computing, Data Science, and Society, and in particular, two institutions within that division, the Department of Statistics and the Berkeley Institute for Data Science. That's BIDS to those in the know. And one other thing, if you have questions, we will be spending the last 10 to 15 minutes taking audience questions. Please submit them through Facebook. So I know many of you are watching on YouTube, many on Facebook. Please submit the questions through Facebook. Okay, so I am going to start with a pretty open-ended question. Right now, we are in this very uncertain time, not just for the next 8 days until the election, but really until we all agree, or at least enough of us agree on the outcome of the election, which could be some time after the actual election. So the question is, what should we expect to see during this time? What are the possible scenarios? Also, how should we interpret them as we begin to see things? Is there some context our five panelists can give us on how to interpret what might play out? And finally, what is the best thing for each of us as citizens to be doing here? So I am going to start this with Philip Stark. Philip, what can we expect? What are possible scenarios here?
Well, many of them are a bit on the doom and gloom side of things. First, want to emphasize that the election is very much underway. Something on the order of 60 million ballots have already been cast, which I think already surpasses the vote by mail turnout in the 2016 election. And in some places, the vote by mail turnout is approaching what the overall turnout was in 2016. Many jurisdictions that have rolled out vote by mail have done it relatively rapidly without a lot of previous experience. And so it's going to be difficult to know how smoothly that process goes. There are a lot of moving pieces in vote by mail that that can lead to failures of chain of custody. I'm not especially concerned about voter fraud in the sense of people who are not eligible to vote casting ballots, but rather things not getting counted that should get counted rather than the other way around. I'm not going to talk about social hacking and misinformation per se, except to the extent that electronic hacking might lead to that. So we may get various kinds of disinformation circulated around things like where you can vote or whether you have voted. For instance, there have been hacks that have sort of told people, oh, just text your vote to the following address, and then you get a reply message saying you voted, which of course isn't true. You cannot vote by text message. Similarly, there may be disinformation about where to vote. We've already seen cases of arson, of voting drop boxes, burning ballots that have already been put into, in some sense, the custody of election officials. That's happened in a couple of places in the US already. I am concerned about the physical security of ballots once they've been cast, and even about physical attacks on local election officials' actual physical plant. There's a lot of technology being rolled out in this election that had either not been used or not been used as widely before. This includes much more widespread reliance on things like electronic poll books, which become a point of vulnerability that can disenfranchise people if they malfunction, if they lose their internet connection, or if they've been hacked. Some jurisdictions are relying on uploading election results using cellular modems or the internet. That, of course, introduces another point of vulnerability, not just to the data that's flowing, but also to the software, the devices that are being connected. Voting equipment itself, there are states that have rolled out touchscreen voting for all in-person voters. This is an unnecessary introduction of brittle and vulnerable technology. Many pieces of electronic technology that are involved in elections are either incorporate devices that were built overseas or assembled overseas, and many crucial functions are being outsourced to foreign companies. One noteworthy example that I'm especially concerned about, there is a Spanish firm called Seidel, which runs, they provide election reporting for something like 11 US states. They're based in Spain and they're bankrupt. So that could obviously is a point of failure where someone could shed a lot of mistrust over the election results by simply falsifying what gets posted. Even if the correct results could ultimately be recovered from durable, reliable records, that would certainly cast a lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt on what's going on. There have been ransomware attacks on government systems, now including some voting systems. We know that there are cyber warfare attacks by Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Most states' voter registration databases were penetrated in 2016. There isn't a lot of evidence that data were changed, but that could certainly happen this time around and could lead to disenfranchisement if you show up to vote and you're told you're not registered, you're not eligible to vote in this particular place. One of the things that I'm particularly concerned about is that with such a large number of votes being cast by mail, we do know that it's a more popular means of voting for Democrats than for Republicans. President Trump has kind of primed the pump by saying that vote by mail is fraudulent. We are likely to see, as the vote by mail ballots get counted on election day and the days that follow, that there is a blue shift in the tallies, which will then, of course, reinforce theories that there was fraud and conspiracy, regardless of how accurate the actual tallies are. I'm personally worried about physical violence, violence in the streets, armed militias, and so forth, keeping voters, intimidating voters, keeping them away from the polls, and possibly making it difficult for election officials to do their jobs afterwards. And there's more than 300 civil lawsuits going on either seeking to expand access to the polls or restrict access to the polls. Those things are likely to play out during and after the election over some months. I think some of the cases are likely to make it to the Supreme Court. But all in all, there's a lot of confusion. There are a lot of points of vulnerability. There are a lot of known problems. There are some election vendors who have been hacked. Before 2016, VR Systems was hacked in Florida. Some of their clients were, there were phishing attacks against them. This time around, let's see, I've forgotten the name of Tyler Technologies, which provides some vote by mail ballot tracking and some vote aggregation reporting, has also been hacked. So overall, there's an awful lot that can go wrong. There are ways to get solid evidence. The best thing we can be doing is marking paper ballots by hand and entrusting them directly to the custody of voting officials to the extent that we can, depositing our ballots in drop boxes rather than entrusting them to the U.S. mail, given the fact that the U.S. mail has been hobbled, if not crippled. Thanks very much.
That's a lot of worries. Thank you for that. It really points to all the potential vulnerabilities. Now I'd like to turn to Henry Brady, and I'm very much hoping he will give us a historical perspective and let us know maybe what we didn't know about previous elections. Henry.
Thanks, Jennifer. I wish I could say everything's going to be fine because the governmental systems are strong and people are sure that there'll be a legitimate election because they trust the government. Unfortunately, I think we're the victim here of an administrative system which is piecemeal, of a history which is problematic, and finally with a loss of trust in institutions in America, which has really created a lot of problems. Let me go through each one of these. We have 10,000 election jurisdictions in the United States, 3,000 counties, plus many states which use townships or cities for their election administration. Many of these are very small. Many of them are very partisan. The people who run them are elected on a partisan basis. Many of them aren't very sophisticated. In some jurisdictions, people are very sophisticated, but in many others, given that there's 10,000, they're not so sophisticated. And this is a legacy of a system that was designed to try to control voters in various places. In the South, to control the African-American vote and to repress it, and in the North to actually control the folks who came over as immigrants and were part of the political machines. And so this history of jurisdictions that are very local, not very sophisticated, and not really quite ready to deal with all of these problems is a real concern. I mean, the good news is there's so many of them, it's hard to believe they all could be hacked. The bad news is, unfortunately, some of them are so unsophisticated they can and will be hacked without a doubt. And so that's a problem. The history is a problem here too. We've had 5 elections where the winner did not win the popular vote, 2 of them since 2000. This kind of situation leads to people being disgruntled. Their candidate won the popular vote but lost the Electoral College. That doesn't seem fair. We've also had 3 elections, although none since 1876, that ended up in the House of Representatives. And that could happen again on this go around. The final thing that is really worrisome in my mind in many ways is that people's trust in institutions has been degraded over the last 30, 40, 50 years. And it's especially been degraded in the last 4 years. So the issue is not just trustworthiness of the system. And Phil has given you many reasons to not trust the system, that it really doesn't work all that well. There's also the question of how much do you trust the institutions which adjudicate problems when they arise with that system. And unfortunately, people's trust in government, but also in institutions like the press, science, higher education, and many other institutions has really declined. And furthermore, it's very polarized. Some people trust one institution, but not another. In 2000, I was in Florida working with a citizens group to deal with the butterfly ballot case, which was one of the problems that arose in that election. This is the Bush versus Gore election. The butterfly ballot arguably cost Gore 2,000 votes, and that was enough to have changed the election so that he would have won. This was an incredibly charged and difficult period. It was quite crazy in Florida in 2000, but the current situation could be worse. We had fewer mail ballots in 2000, and less concern about the integrity of the election system going into the election. Indeed, there wasn't that much discussion of the integrity of the system going into the election. There were very few court cases going into the election. Now there's, as is reported, hundreds or thousands even of them. There was greater trust in government at that time and in these other institutions. And finally, there was less actual partisan claiming even after the election of November 8th in that case, because the various sides really wanted to protect the integrity of the entire system and didn't want to downplay it. So in short, 2000 was a mess, but this could be worse.
Okay, thank you so much, Henry. Now we're going to turn to Susan, whose expertise is in what we might call problematic elections overseas. So perhaps she can shed some light on how we sit in this constellation of problematic elections.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. I do think that there's a lot of ways in which we might think about these US elections being, in some ways at least, unprecedented, certainly in recent memory. As Jennifer mentioned, I've studied and observed elections around the world in countries that have politics that are characterized by high levels of polarization, the potential for election fraud, the potential for election violence. And what I wanted to do is, rather than put out ever more doomsday scenarios for everyone to consider, I wanted to try to use those experiences and think about what we might hope for as the best case scenario in the upcoming US elections. One of the things that we have seen globally and comparatively in a number of countries is that in occasions like these, it can be the case that citizens are willing to put aside their partisan differences, or at least enough citizens are willing to put aside their partisan differences in order to what we might call come out and defend democracy. And there's a number of ways in which they might do that. But one of the things to note, for example, is that it's reasonably clear in US law that voter intimidation is illegal in all 50 states. And this is something that citizens should know. They shouldn't have to think about it all of the time. But it is possible that fellow citizens, fellow voters, and other individuals around the country will not only turn out to vote, but will understand the role that they can play in protecting the right to vote for their fellow voters and fellow citizens. One of the things that's also clear from this, and that is tied a little bit to Henry's comments, which is that the margin of victory does play a role in all of this. Why is that? It's because very, very close elections, even small irregularities rather than overt strategies of manipulation, can play a really important role in swinging an election result. But as the margin of victory grows, and especially in a case like this, if the opposition is winning by a large margin of victory, it can result in a post-election period in which the potential for violence is significantly reduced. Why? Because the claims about manipulation, the claims about the problems that are potentially associated with the election become less consequential, in part because the margin of victory is so large. So that's something to think about. It's not the only thing that we can think about. But I do think that we want to consider it. The other reason why I think it's important, I agree with a lot of the problems that have been brought up and the assessment that my colleagues have given you about US elections. But I am a little bit concerned about our ongoing focus on doomsday scenarios. We don't really know. I think it's very good to prepare and to try to prevent all of the things that we can prevent. But we don't really know how regular voters or voters who might be choosing between participating and not participating in the days to come, how these concerns and the walking through of what are some more unlikely scenarios or more frightening scenarios, how this affects voters. And so I think that we want to be aware that some voters will be mobilized by this information and some voters will be demobilized by this information. But ultimately, it's an empirical question. We don't have a great answer to the question at this time period. And what I'm hoping we can continue to talk about is what citizens can do to defend democracy, including, for example, the last thing I'll leave you with is the notion that we shouldn't assume the election quality based on who wins or who loses. There are going to be a lot of sources of information about objective election quality. I encourage everyone to look for those sources in the days after the election, and to really think about what they can do to help spread accurate information about what exactly went wrong with the election, and what the consequences of those problems were in light of the election results. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would now, I hope my internet connection is okay. I'm getting some little flashes that it's unstable, but I would now like to turn to David Wagner and to ask him for his comments on these questions. And especially, he is one of the world experts on the technical aspects of this. So maybe in that context or another context, David.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, I come at this with a bias towards the technology side of thing because I focus on computer security. And I've been working on election security since about 2004. I got started as an activist when I saw the technology that was being deployed that had serious security problems that I found really disturbing to see. Our democracy relying on technology with such major flaws. And since then, I've gradually shifted, worked for counties, for states. Now I'm on the federal committee that writes technical standards for voting systems. And I guess what I would say from that 15 years of experience is first, I think we've come a long way. From a technology perspective, I think this might be the most secure technology, the most secure voting systems we've ever had. This election will have 95% of our votes are expected to be cast on some kind of voter verified paper record. Something like about half of states are expected to audit the ballots after the election to cross-check the paper records against electronic records. And I think these are powerful measures that can help support confidence in the results of the election and that the votes were counted correctly. So I think that's tremendous progress. Those are high watermarks for those numbers. And I could talk about some of the technology risks and ways that things could go wrong. But in retrospect, I think maybe what I got wrong in my career of work on this was focusing too much on the technology. And my sense is that right now, maybe the people and the social institutions are more important right now. Right now, if you want to hack an election, I think the easiest way to do that is not by hacking the technology, but by hacking the people. And so if you want to talk about risks, the two biggest risks that I could see for this election right now are disinformation and disruption. So by disinformation, I mean things like trying to influence voters through social networks, a fake activism, this kind of thing. And disruption, I'm thinking of things like the potential for hacking of voter registration databases or vote reporting systems, as Philip Stark mentioned, or hacking of networks of local election officials, as Henry Brady mentioned, with the goal there of spreading distrust. That's not going to, I expect these would be detected and corrected. They would not change the election outcome, but they might spread distrust. So those are the two biggest risks I see. And the other impression that I've come from my work on this is I want to highlight election officials as a natural treasure. I've worked with a lot of election officials, and it's very easy for me to be cynical about government, but I've come away with so many positive impressions. We have a tremendous group of diligent, dedicated public servants who work in good faith. They're underfunded. They work with very little public attention. There's no recognition unless something goes wrong. And I think are doing a great job. And so if you'd like to know, if you'd like to look for a trusted source of election information, if you'd like to learn a little more or get a little more with the machinery of elections, I invite you and encourage you to go meet your local election official, go observe how they count the ballots. In my experience, they're very open to having observers come and watch the processes, and in future elections, volunteer as a poll worker. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. And finally, we turn to Steve Weber. Steve is someone who started out in political science and then moved to the School of Information. And I think he has many really insightful things to say, a really unique outlook on this. Steve.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks everybody for the opportunity. I just want to make a quick summary point on infrastructure and then talk a little bit about foreign interference. I think it's almost axiomatic to think of the kind of voting infrastructure, the complex mix of technology, information flow, and as David put it, the human decision that ends up being a vote. And I think thriving societies and great civilizations build great infrastructure. Think of the Roman Empire. And if you visited, say, Shanghai Airport in Singapore or taken a Chinese bullet train, these aren't really democratic states, of course, but it's just worth noting how much easier it is to vote in Singapore than it is to vote in San Francisco. And I think what we've heard from our colleagues is that our electoral infrastructure is kind of as bad as our roads and bridges and airports, and of course today, our power utilities. So reasonable people can disagree over how it got so bad, but I just want to point out that the underinvestment in that infrastructure, I think, is the long-term issue. And even though I'll confess I have a less apocalyptic vision of what's going to happen next week than Philip, I hope there's a clear result. I hope there's no violence. I hope there's a smooth transition. But I think the most important thing, and the one thing I really wouldn't want listeners to lose, is the notion that if things go well, let's not let complacency seep back in on the other side. Let's not forget that we have to address the longer term deficiencies so that we aren't having the same conversation in 2024. Now, a couple of quick thoughts about foreign interference. I think one has to say now that elections have become a primary battleground in societal warfare on the international scene. In 2016, we talked a lot about foreign interference, about particularly Russian interference in US elections. It's actually surprised me how little we've talked about that in the last few months. We've said a lot of things about hyper-partisan politics, domestic misinformation. These things are really important, but I fear that they understate the degree to which adversaries on the global stage are using this election to undermine American democracy, to undermine American power, and to undermine the cohesiveness of American society, which is, of course, ultimately the fundamental source of both. Our foreign adversaries have a very deep understanding of the cleavages in American society. Even in 2016, Russian disinformation campaigns were focused around inciting racial tensions. US intelligence just revealed last week that a bunch of threatening emails that were received by Democratic voters, supposedly from the Proud Boys, actually came from Iranian cyber operators. And I'm quite sure that after the election, we'll hear many more stories and see much more evidence of foreign interference. Whether or not it made a difference in the outcome, it's going to create uncertainty with regard to the winner. And I think my final point is that this should not be a surprise. This kind of foreign attack should be entirely expected because it's actually a historical constant among great powers. Throughout history, governments tried to undermine each other by exacerbating political and economic cleavages in the domestic environments of their adversaries. It's the rule, not the exception. After the Napoleonic Wars, the remaining great powers of Europe, exception, got together and agreed that they were not going to, at least for a while, fan the flames of revolutionary ideology in each other's domestic politics. It didn't last very long. So what we see today is more like the historical norm. Iran, Russia, China, probably other governments using the US election as a means to weaken the United States. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to kind of play off the famous saying by German military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, who said war is politics by other means. Today, maybe it's fair to say elections have become war by other means, because that is precisely how this election is being viewed in places like Moscow, Tehran, and Beijing. If we have done one thing wrong, it's to make it very, very easy to be the target of those attacks. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Steve. You know, we have maybe, I don't know, 3-4 more minutes on this question, but the part that I haven't seen yet or heard yet is, what should a citizen do? There are a lot of citizens watching this. And as this unfolds, what is the appropriate action for a citizen to take here? Because it could be a while. I don't know if there's someone who would like to say, okay, Philip, just a minute or so, yeah.
So first of all, vote. Vote using a hand-marked paper ballot if you can, if that's available to you in your jurisdiction. That might require getting a vote by mail or absentee ballot. There are jurisdictions where on election day you will not be able to get a hand-markable paper ballot, and that includes a lot of Georgia, if not all of it, except on an emergency basis, Los Angeles County, California, and other places that have moved to touchscreen voting devices to mark a ballot. So first of all, vote using hand-marked paper ballot if possible. If you can drop off the ballot in person, or vote in person rather than committing it to mail, that's a better option. You can volunteer as a poll watcher. It's probably a little late to volunteer as a poll worker, but check with your local election officials to find out whether you can. And you can try to encourage your jurisdiction to audit on a voluntary basis. David Wagner mentioned that some states are auditing. There's currently only a couple of states that have statutes that require auditing in such a way that would catch and correct incorrectly reported outcomes before they become final. There are some states like Florida that Henry talked about a lot, that have basically made it illegal to audit in a way that is effective or in a way that would be legally binding. I'll shut up so someone else can talk.
Okay, would someone else like to, yes, Susan.
I think that the two things I'd focus on are that in addition to what Philip said, is that voters should be aware of misinformation and that they may be targeted with misinformation in really clever ways, and to do their very best to try to make sure, if they're reacting emotionally to something that they find out about the election, that they do a little bit more homework to try to make sure that that information is accurate before taking action. In addition to voting, I think that there could be a period in the post-election period in which citizens are protesting in various ways. And I'll just add, again, from the comparative perspective, that if we're thinking about defending democracy rather than continuing to contest the election in the post-election period, it's often the case that whoever lost the election does not believe that they lost for legitimate reasons. They often have to be persuaded of that fact. So I think in some ways that can dampen post-election protests if they can be persuaded by political elites that in fact their party lost. But there's another type of protest that I think is very important for defending democracy, and that is if the elections are stolen. If there is widespread manipulation or widespread corruption or widespread problems with the election, and the declared winner, there's contestation over who the declared winner is, it can be a really pro-democratic action to protest in defense of democracy. And that's something we've seen in a lot of countries around the world that's been very important in keeping countries more democratic than they otherwise would be.
I am going to pivot now. That was great. Okay, I'm going to ask a quick question here. I know there's a lot of concern that these protests might turn violent, which is, how do we, if we choose to protect democracy by protesting, what means can we use to mitigate potential violence? I don't know if you, Susan, who have seen some of this, or others would like to comment on this.
I can just say very quickly that nonviolent political action is something that's been well established as a strategy throughout the world. It's something a lot of people are familiar with. That's been part of recent U.S. movements, and I think people can research what that looks like. The other thing is just to be aware that we can. I think that protest that is explicitly bipartisan, if that's possible, and that is explicitly focused on the defense of democracy, is something that I think more people will, well, I'm not sure, but I hope that a lot of people would be willing to let go forward. If there's violent actors in the street, I don't think people need to engage with them, and I'm not promoting that in any ways. I think people have a right to sort of protect themselves, but we're seeing things like this happen around the world, most prominently recently in Belarus, where we've seen many citizens be detained, be killed, be tortured, disappeared by their government, and they're still out there. So I hope that that our citizens, if it comes to that, I hope it won't come to that, but I hope that we can be as engaged in politics as many of our fellow citizens in aspiring democracies around the world.
Okay. Now I'm going to ask each of you very briefly, if there was one thing, just one thing we could do now to prevent this in 2024, to make the election more secure, to ensure the integrity of the election, and to increase trust, which I think all of you are saying lack of trust, distrust, is at the heart of what's going on now. What would it be? Let me start with Steve Weber this time.
So I'm going to say the two magic words that no one has said, and the magic words are social media. So Phil used the phrase fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Social media is the place where that gets spread most efficiently, simply because misinformation and disinformation spread so quickly and with so little friction. It's an area that many of us on the Berkeley campus at CDSS and elsewhere are studying. Everyone is trying to figure that out. But in fact, the immediate policy issues that we're going to encounter over the next couple of years, that we reshape the information environment on the media and in social media in particular, as we remake the regulatory regime around internet business and particularly social media, are critical to the future of democracy. And so I would say to people in the longer term, look, it's easy for your eyes to glaze over when people talk about the intricacies of like the reform of Section 230 and the Justice Department antitrust suit against Google, but you simply cannot let the lawyers, the economists, the lobbyists, and frankly, researchers like us adjudicate these debates and decisions on our own narrow grounds. Citizens need to be heard on these issues, and it's something more than customers and end users of internet businesses, but as citizens.
Wonderful. Thank you, Steve. David, do you have just what's one thing we can do now to make it better in 2024?
I'd like to see better support for our local election officials. They will go to great lengths to make sure everyone's vote is counted. And they're doing it under severe budget constraints. And when they have the budget, they come up with some really innovative techniques. For instance, Los Angeles County is introducing a new system that I think is really interesting. They decided they were not happy with any of the voting systems on the market, so they'd make their own. For instance, one of the things that voters will be able to do in Los Angeles County is fill out their sample ballot, figure out how they want to vote at home, fill it in on an app on their phone, and then when they get to the polling place, they scan it and confirm their vote, and they're on their way really fast. So I think we might see continued improvement in how we run elections, and I'd love to see us support election officials.
Great. Those of us in California know just how complicated our ballot is. It's a very complicated ballot, yes. Okay, Henry, would you like to say something about what we could do, one thing we could do now?
Sure. The thing I'm worried about most right now is the possibility that the networks do an early call. And so what we can say and what we can all agree to is that we will actually not be anxious to get results quickly. We will allow the networks, we will allow the press to take their time reporting on what happens. In 2000, the early call by the Fox Broadcast Network of George W. Bush winning really set the agenda for the rest of the few weeks after that led to the Supreme Court ultimately deciding the election without there having actually been a careful count in the state of Florida. And there should have been, there could have been, and there just wasn't. And that partly was because of the early call. So I would hope that the press and the broadcast media restrain themselves, although it's really hard for them to do that, but they really must.
Okay, Phil, you have, there are many things you're concerned about. Let's choose one to try to fix for 2024.
So David Wagner and I actually wrote a paper in 2012 called Evidence-Based Elections. And I think that that's the direction we need to move. We need to move away from elections that are based on procedures and technology towards elections that are based on the premise that it's not enough to figure out who won. Election officials have to provide convincing evidence that the person they said won really did win. There are basically three ingredients for that. The first is to create a trustworthy paper record of the votes. And I think that in general, that involves using less technology rather than more. I personally see Los Angeles's voting system for all people as a $300 million waste. I mean, it basically undermines the ability of audits to determine who actually won. So first, create a trustworthy paper record of the votes. That generally means hand-marked paper ballots for voters who have the eyesight and dexterity to be able to do that, technological assistance for those who require technology to vote and cast a ballot independently. The second is to take care of the paper trail, to curate it adequately, demonstrably secure chain of custody up through the election and through the audit. And the last is to check the electronically reported results against the paper trail using appropriate statistical methods. In particular, I like something that I invented called risk limiting audits, which is a way of auditing in such a way that if the technology found the wrong winners, you have a high probability of catching and correcting that before the results become final. So again, the 3 C's are create a trustworthy paper trail, keep the paper trail, curate it properly, and check the results against the paper trail.
Okay, and finally, Susan, what would you do today to make things better in 2020?
Great. I agree with the recommendations that my colleagues have made, and I'd like to emphasize one that I think hasn't been mentioned yet, which is the reform that I'd most like to see before 2024 is some movement in all jurisdictions in the United States towards more equitable access to voting for all people in this country. The disparities in access are greater than I think I'm comfortable with, and I think that that's one of the things that seems well within reach and should be something that is a first priority for reform in advance of any future elections.
Wonderful. Well, I am now going to turn to some questions from the audience that came in through Facebook. So let's see. Over here to open this up. Okay, this is a very, very concrete question. Cindy Popik-Petra asks, ballot drop box versus post office. Is there any difference? I know I thought about that when I when I was taking my ballot in. So yeah, does anyone think there's a difference there? Philip.
Yeah, there are drop boxes and drop boxes. A monitored drop box, I think, is a substantially more secure option than entrusting your ballot to the Postal Service. There's a lot that could go wrong under the best of times, but currently we have a Postal Service that has been crippled at least, and it will introduce delays. It's just an extra link in the chain of custody that can break. That said, we do know that drop boxes have, in some rare occasions, become targets for malicious tampering, and including 2 recent cases of arson.
Does anyone else have a different view of Dropbox versus post office?
I had one more thing.
Yes.
Which is make sure that it's an official Dropbox, not a Dropbox that some party or other entity has put out as a decoy.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Does anyone else have a sense of that?
I'll throw one in. The most important thing is to vote. And the difference between these different methods are, we're talking about optimizing a small difference but by far the most overwhelming thing is to vote. If I had my choice, and say personal safety wasn't an issue, voting in person might be the most reliable, because there's no risk that your ballot gets rejected without you being aware of it. But by all means, take any measure that you can to vote. The differences between these are minor.
Yeah, a lot of people feel unsafe in COVID times, and that's you should trust vote by mail. Don't think, oh, it's not going to work. Okay, overwhelmingly likely that your vote will get counted, and and if you feel you're in personal jeopardy, you should not go out. You should vote by mail.
Can I also add to that, for those watching in California and a number of other states now have very functional systems in which you can confirm that your ballot has been received and potentially do something about it if it's lost in the process. And so I did that already. I received a text from my local county confirming that my ballot was received and will be counted in a Dropbox, and honestly, it feels good.
May I interject? States vary widely in their rules around signature verification on absentee vote by mail ballots. Some notify people and give them an opportunity to cure signature problems and allow time for that. Others don't. California is actually very generous. You can cure signature problems until very late in the relatively long canvass period. There are jurisdictions in which it's actually illegal to check the signature. You can only check whether there is a signature. There are places that do let you track your ballot and find out whether it's been received, and others that don't. The deadline for mailing your ballot in varies by jurisdiction. In some cases, it's based on a received by date. In other cases, a postmark date. That can be problematic because the post office does not postmark every single piece of mail. So there's a lot of wrinkles to all of this.
Okay, I am going to go to the next question here. The next question is from Arturo Rodriguez. He asks, can anyone electronically change votes that are already cast? So I know this speaks to some of the concerns that have been voiced. I did hear the figure that 95%, for 95%, there's some paper trail. How about the other 5?
I could talk about that.
Yeah, okay, please do.
We studied this question. I was on a team that was selected by then Secretary of State Deborah Bowen to study all of California's voting systems back in 2005. And what we discovered at the time, we were given full access, was that every single one of the voting systems, we could hack into them and change electronic results. And I don't think that has changed in any fundamental way. I think that someone with enough level of technical knowledge and sophistication and access could hack in and change electronic results. But here's why I think you can trust the elections anyway, despite that, which is that in most cases, we have the paper records, and many places will do a cross-check against the paper records. And so we have an opportunity to detect if that's happened and to correct it. Now, in those 5% of places, in the small handful of places that are voting on purely electronic systems, I believe we've got to fix it, that those systems are fundamentally vulnerable and that we do not have any satisfactory way to secure them. And we just gotta work on changing that. And we've made tremendous progress, and we'll get there.
May I jump in and contradict David? So, I think it's still in excess of 20% of US voters are voting on technology that doesn't produce a paper record at all. And some of the jurisdictions that have switched towards systems that produce a paper record are producing that paper record electronically using touchscreen voting machines, ballot marking devices that you make your selections on screen and then it prints a record of the vote. Experiments that have been done at University of Michigan and Rice University show that the vast majority of voters will not notice if the printout doesn't match their intended selections. The study at University of Michigan shows that in an experiment where they altered a vote, at least one vote on every single ballot, about 6.7% of voters noticed that there was an error and reported it. Signage didn't really make any difference. Basically, the only way to get people to notice at a reasonable rate was to give them a slate of written votes to check their results against. So I don't think that the existence of a piece of paper that's the record really helps. I think hand-marked paper ballots are the way to go for those voters who don't have a disability that would preclude them from hand-marking a paper ballot. All of that said, I think that there are much easier ways to hack the outcome of the election than to change the way voting machines are recording votes. In particular, the tabulation systems that are more centralized and the reporting systems, especially the reporting systems that have been outsourced to other countries or third parties. And in particular, this Clarity Elections owned by CITL is responsible for 11 states' election reporting. Even if the problem were eventually discovered, we'd still have the fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And many states don't seem to have robust systems in place to double check what's been posted against the underlying paper record. Many states have some provision for audit, but essentially there's really only a couple of states that have reasonable provisions for audit that would catch and correct errors in the outcome.
So I want to say I just learned something else from all of this that we can do. Those people who are voting in person should check the printout of their ballot. Okay, that's a very concrete action that people can take. And moreover, if they uncover discrepancies, they will probably not just be uncovering discrepancies for themselves. I mean, maybe they just voted wrong on something. But if it's systematic, if too many people discover discrepancies, then, you know, they may have to just go in and change it, like just pivot to you know, paper ballots right there and then. So I think this is something that we should be doing as citizens. When we walk out, just check the paper record that they've given us. Okay, does anyone else have a comment on that question? A lot of our questions are very technical.
Jennifer, can I just add a quick thought to sort of double click on what?
Yes.
I think what Philip said is so important. Statisticians would probably never use this phrase, but I think of it as when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. And most adversaries will try to attack an entire system by looking at the weakest link in the system. It's very easy for us sometimes to imagine very, very, very sophisticated technical attacks. It would be very, very hard to do because they're scientifically more compelling. But as Philip said, I think the easiest way to change a vote is before the person ever marks the ballot. And the easiest way to change a vote, probably from a vote to a no vote, is to find a way to prevent someone from ever entering the ballot booth or marking their paper ballot. So when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras.
Okay, that is a very good point. I think that really speaks to another thing that we as citizens could and should be doing. You know, helping people get to the ballot box, making sure that they have transportation if they need it. I know a lot of people are just calling and encouraging people to get to the ballot box, and then, you know, making sure that they are not intimidated at the ballot box. So again, this is probably going to make a bigger difference than electronic manipulation, and it's something in which we as citizens really participate. So Oh, Henry, please.
I just want to
yes.
say something quickly, since I got into this business in 2020, and it is really distressing to me that even after the Help America Vote Act, which was an attempt to try to solve some of these problems, we're still in a situation where we haven't put in anywhere near the best technology that we could put into place. And that includes the kinds of things Phil's talking about. It also includes post-election audits where we go through and we look for outliers and odd things that happened. We can't often fix those after the fact, but at least we know something happened and we can figure out how to avoid it in the future. So it's just a tragedy that we're not further along. And it is an embarrassment, actually, I think, to us as a nation that we're not further along. And there is a bill, HR 1, that people can support that would actually solve a lot of these problems.
So, and I think actually that's what David had spoken to, that we should get the infrastructure right, that we have, like our bridges are crumbling, our election infrastructure and the rules around it should be made more secure. Now, there's somebody who has asked a question a couple of times, so I'd like it to start with the definition from one of you. Gary Duckworth asks, please share any insight on the subject of ballot harvesting. So first, who can tell us what ballot harvesting is? Anybody? Yeah, anyone else? Or okay, Philip, tell us what ballot harvesting.
I mean, generally, it's collecting ballots on behalf of other people and in order to turn them in. And sometimes you're going door to door saying, "Please give me your ballot. I will make sure it makes it to the right place." Another flavor of it is to try to intercept ballots before they've been received by the voter, and that could be a vector for voter fraud. Vote fraud, not voter fraud. But in general, this means kind of getting between the voter and the local election official.
And do we have any insights on how prevalent that might be? I mean, I know a lot of people worry about, whether they've, oh my, what if my husband, for example, got 2 different ballots and I got only 1. In our registration, it seemed that we had both been registered twice. We had just arrived in the state. We did it at the DMV and we did it in the primary. And they caught, before sending out the ballot, they caught that I had been registered twice. They didn't catch that my husband had been registered twice. They sent him 2 ballots. Of course, he only filled out 1 and sent it in. What happened was, when we checked if our votes were being counted, mine was counted, his was not, probably because they had noticed the duplication and invalidated the one he sent in. So, I mean, I know that there are lots, and so hopefully he's going to get his proper vote counted. He sent the other one in, said, I didn't use this. So hopefully there's time for that. David, can you speak on how prevalent this is? How much people should be worrying about this?
So first of all, what we know is that in modern times, is kind of a fraud is extremely rare. It's very rare to see fraud with ballots, and of the cases where it does appear, it's overwhelmingly appeared with absentee ballots, with vote by mail ballots. There have been a very limited number of cases where, for instance, a postal worker tampered with hundreds of ballots, or a worker at in a nursing home was influencing how the residents there voted. Philip mentions a criminal case in North Carolina. There's a handful of cases, but it's, in the overall scheme of things, it's very rare. So I think that generally the discussion of voter fraud, this kind of fraud that happens with these absentee ballots, is, we're talking about rarer than lightning striking. And tends to happen in very small numbers. There's a variety of procedures that different states are using to try to combat this. Some will allow each individual person to turn in only more than a few ballots. Others will allow a large number. So this is where the fine details of the election procedures, I think, can make a difference. Another thing I've noticed is that I've noticed a common conception that people move from one state to another, and then they think they could vote in both states. And states are starting to catch on to this. Many states will now have a matching program with their neighboring states, with other states around the country. And so if you try to vote in more than one place, some of them will catch it in advance, but other ones will catch it after the fact. So the system actually has more safeguards against this than is commonly appreciated.
Right. That's what I was saying with mine and my husband's. The duplication was noticed at one point for me and in another point for him, but it picked up both of them. It is time to wrap up. I want to thank everyone. I found this such a compelling panel. I especially appreciated Susan's comparison to the international picture, which I think actually feel a lot more confident in our system because, elections do work and they work well. But going forward, we should fix our crumbling infrastructure. We should make sure there's always, always a written trail of every vote. And most of all, we should try to get back to a position of trust in our institutions. So let me thank all of you, and I hope that our audience out there found this useful. Bye-bye.